So we're live. Thank you everyone for joining. So to those of you watching live on Facebook, on the Dhaka Tribune Facebook page, and to those of you who have joined via Zoom, greetings. This is the CES Leadership Talk for fall of 2021. Some of you might know CES is a short form for the Center for Enterprise and Society, which is a leading think tank in Bangladesh, based out of ULAB. This talk happens once a semester and is intended to share insights from businesses and civil society leaders for a wider audience. So we do this before COVID. We used to do this in our auditorium at ULAB for the benefit of students, but now what we do is we do it both for students and the wider audience of people tuning into Dhaka Tribune. This event will also be shared on the ULAB Facebook page, the CES Facebook page, of course, and the ULAB EMBA Facebook page. Now, without further ado, let's just move on to this leadership talk. The title of today's talk is something that has been of great interest to me and to our speaker here as well. The title is The Value of a Liberal Arts Education. And I have with me a very esteemed person. His name is Dr. Omar Amir, a very close friend of mine, I'm very proud to say, who's a clinical assistant professor at the ICANN School of Medicine at the Mount Sinai Brookdale Department of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine, and the medical director of the Age-Friendly Acute Care Unit at Mount Sinai Morningside. He has first-hand experience dealing with COVID-19 outbreak in New York City when it was the epicenter of the global pandemic. Before joining Mount Sinai, Omar was a faculty member of the Massachusetts General Hospital Program in Rural Health Leadership, which is a very novel fellowship program that provides training to early career primary care physicians practicing in rural underprivileged communities. And Omar educationally has received his MS from the Harvard School of Public Health and an MD from Stanford University, and he has a Bachelor of Arts from Dartmouth College. I'd like to invite Omar in now. And Omar, have I covered everything? Because you do have a phenomenal CV. And in case I've missed anything, if you want to highlight anything about your career so far, that for the sake of our audience, over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Sajid. It's a very kind introduction, and really, I'm very delighted to join you today for this talk on a topic that is near and dear to my heart as well. I think, in terms of my career, I think what I would say is there's three main areas where I focus right now. One is in a clinical leadership role. So as you alluded to, I direct the Age-Friendly Acute Care Unit, which is essentially a unit where we take care of really frail older adults who are in the hospital. And I also ran a COVID unit here in New York City at the height of the pandemic, and so we took care of all COVID patients.
Amazing.
I'm the clinical lead for geriatrics at my hospital here. And in that role, I manage an interdisciplinary team, and we deal with things like preparedness, obviously for pandemics like COVID now. It's become an increasing part of our focus, but also we deal with patient safety, quality care, and in that role, I lead an interdisciplinary team, which includes pharmacists, social workers, physical therapists, students, trainees. And that brings me to my second role, which is really a role of education. Mm-hmm. So in this capacity, I'm an assistant professor at the Icahn School of Medicine here. I interact a lot with medical students and also residents who are training in internal medicine at our residency training program at Mount Sinai. We have a very diverse group of trainees, actually from all over the world. And we have medical students who've trained actually in South Asia who come to do a residency at our residency program. So I've mentored a fair number of residents in that capacity as well. I also am a faculty advisor for a humanism society here at the School of Medicine. And in that role, I help students really develop a mindful approach towards the practice of medicine, incorporating lessons from the humanities and inculcating really a compassionate and empathic approach to the practice of medicine. And then finally, I have a health equity focus. And really what that means is, how do we make sure that the benefits of medical care accrue not just to socially advantaged populations, but to populations that are on the periphery. Mm-hmm. And so in this capacity, I actually spent some time at an Indian reservation, a Native American reservation, mm-hmm. in South Dakota. I work with the Lakota people, and over there I'm developing, in collaboration with the Massachusetts General Hospital, a program for the care of older adults who are disproportionately affected by aging outcomes, because they live, far from access to care, and have a lot of socioeconomic factors that impact aging. So I hope to answer some of the questions about liberal arts education, I think from a bunch of different lenses, but primarily I think from a leadership role, since that's the focus of this talk.
Very, very, of course I knew about a lot of things you're doing, Omar, but it's just amazing to be reminded of the other sorts of tangential areas that your work has taken you. For example, I was going to ask you, like I was discussing before we went live, I had decided to ask you about a lot of our nostalgic sort of collaborative experiences, because we've done papers together on this liberation war of Bangladesh. We've done philosophy courses together, courses on spirituality and religion, and so I was going to talk about how these things have helped you now that you're a medical practitioner. But a lot of things you're mentioning now, I think, will be also of great interest to our audience, such as the fact that you're training of South Asian residents. I think for a lot of people watching, there might be many who are either medical practitioners or students. So I think it'd be interesting to also hear your perspective of how you think the overall state of education is when it comes to medical education in South Asia, which by my understanding, of course, there are differences between, let's say, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, but one could make generalizations that are helpful. I also want to talk about what you just mentioned, Omar, about mindful medicine or mindful practice of medicine, because I'm someone who's generally been, I would like to think, benefited by various practices of mindfulness. And there's also research in my field, so to speak, when it comes to startup leadership and how how its intersection with mindfulness, and how that has often led to better outcomes, even financial outcomes, and more sustainable outcomes. So a lot to talk about, Omar, but I just want to start by, maybe for the sake of the audience, by just giving a brief background, and I'll let you come in. So we both went to Bangladesh. We both went to Dartmouth College, which is in the U.S., in New Hampshire, of sort of a very cold part of the U.S. Very cold, in fact. It was difficult for me in terms of how cold it was. Omar seemed to manage well, but anyway, it was challenging. It was a very difficult and intense environment for 4 years, and we did liberal arts at Dartmouth. So for those of you watching, ULAB is not some unique beast in that it's liberal arts and the only liberal arts institution. There is a lot of American universities who are founded and run on the principles of liberal arts education. And as a matter of fact, the trustees of ULAB, just for the sake of a background, have all attended very fine liberal arts schools in the US, Brown, Wesleyan, to name a few. And so their vision was to basically come and start in Bangladesh something that they experienced in the US. So we'll definitely get into all that. But Omar, I want to just start by saying, and just one more piece of background. Omar is originally from Pakistan, from Karachi. So I just thought maybe, Omar, we could start with our story of how we co-wrote a paper on the 1971 liberation war of Bangladesh, and some of the realizations you had, and just to sort of maybe start with something that people will relate with, and also just share with people the plethora or just the scale of diversity that we were dealing with when we were in college. Over to you, Omar, if you want to just take us through some of your things.
So I think one of the really valuable aspects of a liberal arts education is to help you examine your intellectual and pedagogic instruction and beliefs, right? And so the liberal arts education really should give you a set of skills to start to think critically and apply the tools of logic and textual analysis and all of these things that we learn in liberal arts education. And I think the setting is really important as well. So you talked a little bit about...
One sec, Omar, if I may come in, and I think I do want you to talk about the setting, but for the sake of the audience, right? Because some of us, of course, those of us watching will know immediately what Omar is talking about when he talks about critical thinking.
Yeah.
You want to explain what that means, or give an example of how we were taught, or we were trained, so to speak, or we practiced thinking critically in college?
Yeah, I actually think this course that you're referencing is a really good example of that. And this course has really stayed with me. So just from a bit more background, this was an American history course, the history of American foreign policy specifically, that we took in college. And the premise of this course was to really delve into the primary documents around foreign policy, and specifically American foreign policy involvement in the 1971 conflict in Bangladesh. And what really has stayed with me is the fact that what I came in with, right? I mean, and you mentioned my background from Pakistan. So we came in with a specific understanding of that history, as you can imagine, and as your readers can, your viewers can appreciate. And it starts with a narrative, right? It starts with a historical narrative, and then there are supporting evidence or supporting examples that are chosen from that history to bolster that narrative. And that's the kind of historical education that I received coming in to this course in high school. And coming into this course, I was really challenged in terms of this framework of viewing history. And what we really learned in this course was to discard these a priori notions and to really start with the primary textual material and the primary documents. And we were fortunate because by this time, a lot of these documents had actually been declassified and were available. And so we looked at a bunch of memos and other documents that were released by the American consulate in Dhaka at the time of the 1971 genocide, right? And central to this was the infamous blood telegram written by, sent by Archer Blood. And that telegram and sort of, this trove of documents that had been declassified really opened my eyes to what actually was going on in terms of the firsthand accounts of the key players at that time. And it allowed me to then construct an analysis of what actually had been the role of the Pakistan military forces and the supporting role of American foreign policy, Kissinger, etc. And that led to a completely different point of arrival in terms of the conclusions that you reach, right? And so, when I think of this course, what it gave me was really a paradigm shift, and that I think is one of the ways in which a liberal arts education is so powerful, is it allows you to deconstruct and examine the assumptions around any sort of narrative that you may have received, and to begin to learn to apply alternative methods of analysis. And this was an alternative method of analysis. This was an inferential analysis. Mm-hmm. And it really, I think, and that comes to the ultimate point, which is, the point of a liberal arts education is to liberate you from ideological thinking.
Nicely put. Amazingly put. Yeah, just to sort of recap what Omar just said for the sake of the audience. So as a lot of you will know, the 1971 Liberation War in Bangladesh, as Omar, as you just heard him refer to it as 1971 genocide. And you can rest assured that that's not the narrative in Pakistan, and for obvious reasons, for reasons of their own, what have you, political purposes. But the fact that, clearly someone who was studying pre-med at the time had exposure to a history course and about a part of the world that was, where he came from, and was got to understand again, renew his understanding and revise his understanding about history of his own nation in some ways, was something that I think liberal arts education can give you. There are also other examples. And let's say, for example, in my case, and Omar's case as well. Omar, interestingly, is a minor in religion, or did a minor in religious studies. Omar, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the case. Right? Yeah. So he has taken courses. So I don't know if you took, Omar, if you took the course on mysticism in Islam and Judaism, but you took a fair number of courses. And I think one thing we both did is we even took courses on religion, right? And some of these courses were taught by non-Muslims, were taught with this critical sort of approach to the study of religion. And to some extent, how that has impacted me is, I think me, Omar, and I'm sure you feel similarly, I have become a lot more tolerant because of Dartmouth. And a huge area of my research and programming, in addition to the business and entrepreneurship research I do, has to do with promotion of diversity, tolerance, and pluralism in Bangladesh. And that has given me a source of peace, this sort of work, and that really helps me sort of make sense of the work I do in the other fields, such as business and entrepreneurship. So, I think what the thing the audience can take away from whatever we have discussed so far is that, especially students watching, especially people who might be considering a liberal arts education, is that liberal arts, like Omar put it, is intended to sort of unshackle you from ideological shackles, right? So you start being critical of things you have heard, and you start questioning how knowledge forms, or what you have been taught in the past by your priest, by your imam, by your mother and father, by your elders, and even through your school and textbook. And it does really help you develop intellectually and of course as a person, and which ultimately is what stays with you as your career develops and what have you. Or do you want to come in and do you have any comments at this point?
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with all of that. It's really at the point of conflict intellectually that understanding grows, right? So if you're in an intellectual bubble and all the narratives that you've been taught are just reinforced, right? And this is increasingly a problem, both actually in the United States.
Social media, yeah.
Right, social media creates bubbles, right? And it's really only when you come into rigorous contact and conversation with dissenting and alternate opinions that your own understanding of your own positions deepens, and your empathy for an opposing point of view increases. Because very often in some of these courses, like for example, you mentioned the religion courses, I also took a course called Modern and Anti-Religious Thinkers, right?
Very interesting.
And like we
studied like modern anti-religious thinkers.
Yeah.
Oh wow. So that covered Nietzsche and all that, right?
Exactly, Nietzsche, like Hume, etc. And one of the exercises in that course is to really argue from an anti-religious standpoint, right? To use the premises, right? And to form a position based on that as an exercise, right? These are all as an exercise, right? So, and what that challenges you to do is you really have to, inhabit a radically different view and a radically different worldview, right? And when you're forced to do that, you have a much deeper appreciation of what are the underlying assumptions of that worldview. And I think that also leads to tolerance, because if you can inhabit someone else's worldview, even for a little while, and to live in that, I think it fosters empathy and understanding, right? So that we can then begin in our societies, which are, let's face it, they're pluralistic, right? Multi-ethnic, multi-religious. South Asia is, in many ways, it's like melting pot, so many diverse cultures, and micro cultures and ethnicity, etc. It gives you the tools to start to have discussions rather than resort to violent conflict.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And so there are people I think I've met, Omar, especially in our part of the world, in India and Bangladesh, and Pakistan, I'm sure, where people often misunderstand what liberal arts means, because some people can think that it means visual arts, and some people think it means performing arts, right? The fact that it's something completely different is often lost on people, but we've already talked about that. And the other confusion sometimes people have, and this is perhaps a more logical confusion if there is such a thing, and that is, so some people wonder if you are sort of encouraged to take courses in history, religion, geography, what have you, and but you want to be a BBA major, or if you just want to study engineering, or if you just want to study medicine, aren't you wasting your time? A, and B, some people wonder, how is a course on history going to affect me if I want to be a doctor? So what do you say to those sorts of questions?
I think one of the important, let's just take a utilitarian view for a second, right? Like, which is the view of like, how do I succeed in my career and create value
Sure.
in society, right? I think one of the things we have to recognize is that the world is becoming increasingly more complex,
Mm-hmm.
and the pace of change is rapidly increasing, right? And so what that means is, even if you're in a field like medicine or law or engineering, you're going to be dealing with multifaceted challenges that require you to have expertise and skills, or at least the ability to learn entirely new fields, right? So you may have trained as a lawyer, right? But you may end up working with a pharmaceutical company or a cryptocurrency venture, right? And so you have to have enough of a training in economics or history or science that you can then learn what you need to know in order to excel at your job, right? Um, so so that speaks to sort of the dynamic aspect of careers given the pace of change, right? And increasingly, like even in medicine, right? I mean, we are seeing a period of rapid transformation. um, Increasingly we're seeing more automation, like for example, like radiology, we're seeing a lot more algorithmic approaches and things like that. And so the kinds of jobs that you may have trained for will end up in their practice, 10 or 20 years into your career, may end up being very different. You may end up having to lead or manage a team of people. You may end up even if you trained as a doctor initially, you may end up having to deal with a pandemic and pandemic preparedness, right, at your hospital. You may end up having to take on a public health role. You may end up having to take on a pedagogic or educational role at your institution. And so in all of these things, you are then required to quickly master a complex skill set, right? In order to succeed in these increasingly more complicated jobs. So I think that's one answer to this. And related to that, I think, from a leadership lens,
Mm-hmm.
leadership in any of these fields, whether it's engineering or medicine or law, it's an absolute necessity for you to have a broad-based skill set, because you
Very true.
cannot advance as a leader by simply having technical skills.
Yeah.
You have to be an accomplished writer, a critical thinker, orator, right? You have to master rhetoric to some degree.
Yeah.
Even just sort of a small side note, even as a regular physician, I strongly feel that you have to master the art of persuasive speech,
Mm-hmm.
because you may be the best cardiologist in the world, right? But if you can't convince your patient to stop smoking, they're going to have another heart attack,
Yeah.
regardless of the stent you put in, within 10 years. So in order to succeed in your practice, you have to have this multifaceted skill set. And that is particularly true if you are in a leadership role. So I think that's the first point. And then the second point related to that is sort of the dynamic nature of the workplace and the pace of change that's coming to all of our lives. So
Extremely well made points. Thank you. And again, I'll just recap for the sake of if you had people watching, students watching, if you weren't able to catch everything that was said. So Omar sort of answered the question of how liberal arts education might actually help you if you know what you want to do, if you want to be an engineer or a doctor or a business person or a banker even. He made two interesting points why you still need to be open and imbibe other kinds of learning. He talked about leadership, and he talked about the fast nature of change in most of our professions because of, let's say, things like the global pandemic or the digital transformation that is sweeping through globally, which might upend and change a lot of the jobs that you might take for granted right now. Like banking will change, of course. It is changing. The next 10 years, even in Bangladesh, you will see a lot of digitization that has happened. And they're connected, as Omar said. So Omar mentioned the importance of leadership. And so successful professionals, of course, at some point become leaders when you are managing people. And the best way to do that, of course, is not through some pro forma, tips or some leadership guideline, but it's through things like empathy, communication skills, what have you. Omar talked about persuasion skills, public speaking skills, and all these things, I think. And he also mentioned how, to some extent, every specialist that succeeds has to be a generalist at the same time. And that, I think, is very important. And trust me, I know what he's talking about, because as Omar knows, I've considered many different professions before deciding on this. But yeah, thanks a lot. So now let's just talk about South Asia for a second, Omar, because you also mentioned how you've been training residents from South Asia, from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, I imagine. And so what do you think? And I'm sure, knowing you have, to some degree, kept tabs on the state of education, medical education in South Asia. And of course, like I said, there's a big difference, of course, in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. But again, one can generalize about that region, especially in comparison to, let's say, the US. So what do you think is happening in South Asia, and what do you think needs to change at the policy level? Because there could be policymakers watching. So what do you think could help South Asian medical institutions become more competitive?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, the driver for some of this is that, the global marketplace, and you can think of it also as the marketplace for doctors, is becoming increasingly competitive, right? So if you want to train in the UK or the US, and maybe you want to further your medical training in a specific field, whether or not you're going to return to your country, which I think should be encouraged. It's very, very competitive to enter, right? There's huge barriers to entry, and you're competing against the whole world, essentially, right? You're competing with medical trainees in the whole world to come to one of these institutions to do your residency training, for example. And I think the tendency and the risk there is that people tend to kind of back up into a sort of hyper specializing mode. And so what we see in the face of incredible competition, we see people like hyper specializing earlier and earlier, right? So like earlier in your schooling, you would have very math and science centric subjects, right? O levels, A levels, etc., what have you. And then, if you're studying for your USMLE exams as a medical student in India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, right? Because there's such a huge emphasis on the scores for those exams, I know that there are students that actually take out a whole year and study only for that exam, right? So I think that's the tendency, and in some ways the danger, because what we are finding now, and things are changing also in terms of entrance requirements, I might add. So the shift, there is increasingly a shift away from an overemphasis when you look at residency program directors and looking at some of these scores. And what they're a lot more interested in now is, what are your communication skills? Can you, for example, and there are parts of the USMLE that also actually, do a patient simulation exercise and test you on these skills. So the first thing to say is that there is increasingly a shift because we recognize in the US and Western medicine in general that things are becoming much more complex. We're working a lot more as teams, that we have to be much more people-centered and have a strong emphasis on sort of interpersonal skills. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what I notice about students who are coming from South Asia is that they really struggle when it comes to their time on the wards. And the ways in which they struggle really principally have to do with communication and having difficult conversations. So imagine as a newly minted medical student, right, from a very, very hyper-specialized technical education, now you're thrown into a situation where you have a patient who's actively dying, right? This patient is under your care, and you have to have a very difficult conversation with the family, right? And they're talking about whether they're going to withdraw ventilator support, and just a really, really difficult set of conversations. And in order to succeed in this setting, you have to have empathy. You have to understand very different religious, moral, philosophical backgrounds where people are coming from. What are their underlying concerns? How to speak to that? And then ultimately how to guide a process of shared decision-making, right? To come to a conclusion and to really do what's best for this patient. So it's a very interpersonal endeavor. And unless you have the ability to inhabit very different worldviews and guide conversations, listen, summarize, communicate, convince when it's needed, you're not going to succeed in medicine, truthfully, right? So I'll stop there. I have a lot more examples, but I think this really comes to mind because a lot of what we've been doing on my service is having these really difficult conversations in frail older adults who are, seriously ill.
That's really fascinating. So how do we improve? If I'm thinking of from the perspective of, let's say, some of the medical institutions we have in Bangladesh, right? And interestingly, these tend to be among the best educational institutions in the country, as you'd imagine. I'm sure it's similar in India and Pakistan, because we all have a lot of people and hyper-competitive medical institutions and all that, right? Now, one thing I personally find that just from my interaction with doctors and medical practitioners in Bangladesh, and of course there are outstanding doctors I've met in Bangladesh, but I do sometimes feel, especially when I solicit medical advice from external doctors, whether they're doctors in Singapore or even you, for instance, sometimes I've spoken to you, I do sometimes feel like and this is of course coming from someone who's not a medical practitioner, and you'd be able to verify this, I do feel we don't stay as connected to the rapidly changing world of medical research in South Asia as perhaps happens elsewhere. Even Singapore, of course, Singapore is a hyper-developed country, but it's still so close by that I just often wonder. So now, what policy changes do you think could help create, let's say, a more liberal artsy approach to the study of medicine? Or is it a research-based approach that's required? And what do you think is required so that Bangladeshi medical institutions or Indian or Pakistani can start becoming more competitive at the global stage?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think so there's a certain amount of technical education that you do have to master, right? And within a medical school education, what I would say, based on my experience, is that you need at least 2 years to really focus on the clinic, so the basic biosciences of it, right? So you're talking about the microbiology, the biochemistry, the anatomy, physiology, all these things. But 2 years is to be honest, it's sufficient time if you've had the kinds of pre-medical educations that we get already through our O levels, A levels, etc. So I strongly believe that another 2 to 3 years should be set aside for a broad-based training in the humanities. I think that would really help the development of some of these skills that I'm talking about. Things like understanding, how to affect behavior change, right? Understanding some courses in psychology, certainly philosophy, the arts. You mentioned mindfulness as being important to you in your work. And it's incredibly important to medical practice, right? So spending, I think, some time should be within a medical education, I think, should be made compulsory in terms of focusing on some of these broader skill sets. And I think the humanities and liberal arts is a really great way to develop these broad skill sets that we're talking about, right? So, and it can be hard to put it very concretely, because a lot of these are sort of abstract things that you get. So, for example, if you are a student of literature, if you studied poetry, I mean, it gives you a window into human experience, and an understanding of human experience that you can't put into words exactly, but it helps you understand suffering, the meaning of life experience, and these existential questions. And your patients, as a medical practitioner, will suffer, and you have to know how to respond to suffering. And if you have that in as a repository at the back of your mind, if you have that ability, that compassion, that access to these domains, you will be able to relate better to your patients.
So true. Yeah, absolutely. It is extremely true. And I think, so we keep talking about this, of course, but of course, I think we keep coming back to this sort of human-centric approach. And of course, there are lots of terminologies with which this is now expressed. There is human-centric design. Like you mentioned literature, and I think that immediately sort of reminded me of how, and because I took literature courses as well, if you recall, Omar. So, because, and especially when I was at Columbia, which was also very liberal artsy, as you know, I was just thinking about how when we, and because I was also training to be a historian back in the day, if you go really far back in history, you stop seeing archival records. So you stop seeing things like history books. You even stop seeing things like newspapers with which you can reconstruct the history. So let's say, for example, if you had to think of the history of the partition of Bengal, which was in 1947, when Bangladesh had become East Pakistan, the way you would construct history for that is by looking at newspapers of that time. But if you wanted to construct history of East Bengal 1,000 years ago, there are no newspapers. They're not even properly kept courtly records. However, what you find is literature, right? You find literature from that time using very ancient forms of Bengali. So there are ways in which historians have been taught to sort of read into literature, right? And sort of try to create a sense of the worldview of that time. Now, how that helps me even now, especially when I, let's say, do very different things. Like, let's say, for example, when I try to explain the stock market crash that happened in Bangladesh in 2010, I just don't see it as a case of, I just don't see it from the prism of a financial analyst only. I see the role of rumors in creating asset price bubbles. I see the demographic reality of Bangladesh, which is a country that is so densely populated, right? It is a country of 160 million people in the size of Michigan, which does aid a certain type of flow of information. I see things like the role of journalism in creating bubbles. And I'm better able to unpack it, whether I'm dealing with a foreign investor who wants to invest in the stock market. So that's another very, very sort of, I think, very personal way in which I think I very relate to some things you're saying and how, all kinds of trainings help. I do want to sort of shift gears a bit, Omar, and talk about COVID, because I feel like a lot of people watching, especially now that a new variant is on the horizon. Well, it's more than on the horizon. It's probably like here.
It's in the US. It's in New York as well. Fortunately, yeah.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on this new variant?
Yeah. So I think there are a few things that are rapidly becoming clear. One is that it appears to be highly infectious or contagious. We'll have more data. I think it's really a matter of weeks, and we'll get a lot more data. So I think one thing that's very concerning about the new variant is that it appears to be quite contagious. The reports that I'm hearing are that there's a significant breakthrough infection rate even in vaccinated individuals. So that's concerning. And the reason why that's concerning is because when the transmission dynamics are robust, then you really, it can become the dominant circulating strain, right? So right now, Delta is the dominant circulating strain, but there's a potential for the Omicron to replace it. What's not so clear right now is the severity of illness with this variant. So it's very possible, and I hope this is the case, that people will not get severe disease with this. And in a way, if you think evolutionarily, right, and this comes harkening back to sort of using different aspects of your education and training, but like what we know from evolution is that with these viruses, it's actually a competitive advantage to not have severe disease and death in the host, right? So a viral strain that sort of leads to mild illness, but with strong transmission dynamics, is going to be more successful. So it's possible that that's where we're headed with the Omicron variant, but I think it still remains to be seen. We need more data.
Okay, so that's interesting. Omar, do you want to take us through some of your recent experiences handling the outbreak of COVID when it was, from what we understand, it was like wildfire in New York,
right?
And some of the things you dealt with, and just generally advice you might have for policymakers and practitioners who have in the past grappled with COVID, and God forbid, might not need to in the future, but let's just say, God forbid we did. Some of your experiences, of course, I think would be interesting. So what are some of the things you learned about handling COVID? Because you were, as you said, handling a COVID unit as well in New York at the height of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's so many lessons, that you could broadly categorize as, what are the systems level lessons? What are the public health lessons? What are the clinical lessons, right? I'll start with the clinical lessons, right? So I think one of the clinical lessons is that we have to be flexible and understand that what's worked before with a completely novel illness may not work, right? So one of the things that we learned clinically is that this sort of the standard of care for like acute respiratory failure is when you reach a certain point is intubation. And what we learned very quickly is that early intubation actually led to worsened outcomes, and it was actually better to put these types of patients on non-invasive ventilation and to try to really avoid putting a tube in and what we call invasive ventilation, right, sort of as a very last resort. So there were like a myriad lessons from a clinical standpoint, and I think the broader lesson from that is just not getting stuck in previous paradigms and to be able to critically re-examine the evidence as it's emerging, right? And I think we were perhaps a little bit late to that. We were starting to get early signs that this approach is not working. But I think we were a little bit late in recognizing that. And I think we probably could have taken a more rigorous approach to that sort of level of analysis. I think from a systems level standpoint, one really important lesson is the critical necessity for redundancy in hospital systems. So, and this had huge workforce implications. So, hospitals in the United States, and I think many other places as well, really run on a very thin margin, right? So like, there's very little redundancy built into the system. We only have as many service lines as we absolutely need. we try to stretch the workforce as much as possible to get maximum productivity, but that leaves us completely unsheltered from emergent situations where suddenly you need to expand your workforce by 20%. Suddenly you need to have 15 to 20% more physical space in order to accommodate the massive influx of patients coming into your ED. Suddenly you have to have the ability to devise negative air pressure rooms, right? And so like our hospitals, from a physical standpoint and from a workforce standpoint, were not really designed to even sort of accommodate sort of like this, to flex essentially, and to develop like this reserve capacity quickly. So I think that's a really important lesson, is that all of these systems that are dealing with complex situations need to have some redundancy built into the system, or at least the ability to rapidly gain that additional capacity. And then from a public health standpoint, I think one really important lesson, I think is still pertinent today, is the importance of consistent messaging. So one of the issues I think early on in the US is just the messaging around prevention, masks, etc., was not consistent. And that led to a lot of mistrust in the public health system, in really health personnel throughout the country, and that has led to death. People have died because of the role of misinformation, rumor, mistrust, and of course there's a political component to that, but I think that the public health messaging could have been more robust. And I think that sort of, as we think about new pandemics, or even God forbid worsening or new strains with the current pandemic, we have to be really careful about our public health policy. And I think overall, perhaps it's better to err on the side of being conservative and being more careful, and to stick with that line until it's clear from the evidence that that's not needed.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, I'm just going to ask one more question before getting into some of the questions we have received from the audience. You mentioned the politicization, of course, of this, and of course that's not as much an issue in Bangladesh or in South Asia. But I have friends in the US, which will not be named, of course, but I have friends in the US who still think that this masking or social distancing is an expression of governmental outreach, right? And just because they might have survived COVID or might have not have been affected by it, that's still a view. So you do have, so because people watching will of course think that, of course, a medical practitioner or leader like you in the US will have access to a whole lot of resources that perhaps we don't have here. But you also have various complex challenges, and it's not just all rosy, because I'm sure you've dealt personally with situations where you've had to deal with this sort of mindset of resistance, right? So I was just generally curious, Omar, so how is that working out nowadays? Like what is the public perception like towards masking and social distancing? Have more people come in line, or have more people sort of like bought into the science, so to speak? Or is this, or do you think there's still enough resistance the way there used to be, let's say, a couple of years ago, or when COVID first broke out?
So let me put it this way. I think the kinds of ways in which masking and other prevention measures are increasing are not the ways in which we would have wanted them to change, right? So like, what I mean specifically is that when I talk to people who are from a conservative political viewpoint, really what I see most often is a change in their practice, or in change their behavior when it comes to masking and prevention in general, is when a close family member or a close friend is impacted by COVID, right? And so because of the rapid spread now of COVID, particularly in the middle of the country, so like the coast, East Coast and West Coast, relatively doing better with vaccination and masking, etc. But like when I go to South Dakota, which is where my sort of other practice is, where I work on the Native American reservation for my health equity role, I do come into contact with a lot of people with very conservative political views. And what I tend to see is that the people who are changing are the ones who are personally affected in some way, and that convinces them to change, right? So it's still a problem from a educational standpoint. What we really want in an educated population is the ability to go beyond your personal experience, right? And this is what an education needs to do. You have to be able to look at data, abstraction, other people's experiences, and to critically analyze them and to come to your own conclusion, right? And this is coming back to that point about inferential thinking, right? Look at the data and the evidence, right, which may not be in your specific personal experience, right? Critically analyze it and then come to a broader conclusion. And people don't do that. People are still very, very sort of top down, where they start with a narrative that's given to them by Fox News or social media bubble, and then they like selectively filter out evidence and data. And that's what I'm seeing. I can say more about that, but I think very briefly to answer like your other question, which is how do you combat that? I think really for me, what I've learned is it's interpersonal relationships again, right? So when I have a patient that I know and I've known and taken care of for a while, and they trust me because of how I've treated them in the past and my reputation or whatever it is, then that's the point of departure for a better dialogue, right? Then I can listen to them, I can acknowledge what they're saying and acknowledge the fears behind, because a lot of these sorts of decisions are based on emotion, and there's a kind of fear that's motivating these types of behaviors. So like specifically understanding, identifying, acknowledging, and addressing the emotional content of why people are doing certain things allows you then to say, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Here is why I think you may want to take another look at this. And then I give them very specific data, and very often I make it personal, right? I talk about my family, I talk about what I've done, right? And actually in some cases that's led to behavior change. I've been able to convince some people to get the vaccine that came in absolutely, not inclined to do so.
It's amazing. That's amazing. That's very inspirational. I want to be a medical practitioner, but I think this is great because I think a lot of people watching this, and I'm hoping this will reach the right audience as well, because if you're watching this and if you are a medical practitioner, please share this so that others in your community can see this and get some knowledge transfer happening, right? Because I think that is one of the purposes of why we do this. This is a part of our outreach. And Omar has been very kind to give us 52 minutes as of now from his Sunday morning, which, as you know, is a weekend in the US. So thanks.
I'm actually going to be rounding soon because I'm at work in the hospital.
Oh, wonderful! Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, I won't keep you for too long. We're just 2 questions from the audience, and thank you once again for such an insightful discussion. So one question I have from an audience member is somewhat personal, I guess. This person is asking, so what made you choose a medical profession in the first place? Like, what drew you to it?
Yeah, it's a question that I think about every day because it's a challenging field. But in the end, I really couldn't be happier with medicine. So I think, so here's when you really practice medicine at its fullest, you are not just engaged in a continuous intellectual development, right? So you're continually engaged with your mind, but you are continually engaged with human beings, right? So it's intensely relational. And for me, I think the source of meaning in life comes from this intense relationality, right? It comes from like entering into partnership with people at a point where people are vulnerable and need help, right? So if you can at a point where people are vulnerable, sick, in need, enter into that relationship, become a trusted advisor, become a co-decision maker, and help people get to a point where they're either better or have a kind of care that they're receiving that's in accordance with their goals and values. There is nothing like it in the whole world, I think. So for me, that's really the blossoming of a medical practice. And I didn't know all of this when I started. So it's not like these are the exact things that drew me to medicine. But over the course of time, these are the things I've come to appreciate about medicine. So I'll answer this question in that way, because I think that's a more honest answer.
Thank you so much. The other question, Omar, that I wanted your thoughts on, because we've talked so much about the benefits of liberal arts education. So someone's asking, what are the cons of a liberal arts education? Are there any drawbacks or disadvantages that one needs to consider?
Yeah, I think the main thing to think about is certainly the opportunity cost, and I think one thing to point out, in our societies is that there's a lot of pressure, right? There's a lot of pressure, parents, culturally, etc., to start to get into a field and to start to make money quickly, right? So in some ways, taking out a bunch of time, whether it's 4 years or less, to focus specifically on like an exploration of different fields of study can seem wasteful, right? I mean, I think there's a good argument to be made over the course of the whole career, because I think if you put in that investment, you'll end up at a better place in your career eventually. But I think a more sort of short-term drawback could be that, your earning, your entry into the earning workforce may be perhaps possibly a bit more delayed, and there are all sorts of cultural reasons why that could be considered to be harmful in South Asian societies. And one sort of barrier that I faced was cultural, right? So like my parents weren't used to this idea, and so I had got a certain degree of pushback and angst about sort of delaying an entry into the workforce where I was a practicing physician and earning an income. But I think it's worth it in the long run.
Of course, yeah. I do recall the very long durée approach to education in the US for medical sciences, and something that I, of course, came to know after I met you and all that. But this was absolutely amazing, Omar. I'm very, very grateful for your time. I do miss the conversations we used to have and late into the night when we were undergraduates at Dartmouth, at this cafe that we both frequented because it was open 24 hours. And being South Asians, both Omar and I were very, I guess, conscientious students. So, and of course, I think we did adda or chatted more than we studied. But anyway, this was great for me. This was very fun and very rewarding for me, Omar. And I hope this was an interesting experience for you. And I hope you'll stay. Of course, I'll be in touch with you as a friend, but I hope we can also be in touch professionally at some level, and perhaps collaborate in the future for any outreach you might want to do in this part of the world.
I would love to, Sajid, and it was an absolute pleasure catching up with you, chatting, and answering these wonderful questions from your audience as well. Thank you.
So that's it for the audience watching. Thank you for tuning in. This was Sajid Amit from the ULAB Center for Enterprise and Society, and we just finished an event with Professor Dr. Omar Amir. So if you have any further questions, feel free to write us via messages on Facebook, wherever it's going live, wherever we're seeing it, and we'll surely get back to you ASAP. Thank you, Omar. Stay safe, and regards to the family.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.